welcome to this Mint House event, looking at new approaches for responding to environmental harm, which has been organised in conjunction with the European Forum for Restorative Justice. Um, just a brief introduction for those of you who might not be familiar with the Mint House. We are a centre for restorative practice based in Oxford, and we promote restorative approaches in a variety of contexts. We do local training here in Oxford, but also we do work nationally and internationally. I'm really interested in seeing how we can have relational restorative approaches, help people to embed those in lots of different ways of working, lots of different places. Um, Today's event is specifically, as I said, looking at environmental harm and how we might be able to respond to environmental harm and different and innovative ways of doing that. This event, as I said, has been organised in conjunction with the European Forum for Restorative Justice, because earlier this year they published a practice guide on environmental harm and restorative justice approaches to environmental harm. So in a moment, I'll share that link in the chat for those of you who haven't had a look at that practice guide. We will be briefly presenting some highlights from that guide today. So if you haven't read it before, that's absolutely fine. That's why we're holding this event. But if you would like to read it in full, which I would obviously encourage, I'll share the link in a moment so you can do that. I am recording the event today, and you hopefully will have had a notification when you joined. I only really use the recording of the person who is speaking. So if you would prefer to not appear in a recording, we'll put that on our website and on YouTube. If you prefer not to appear in that recording, just keep your camera off and your audio off. But at a later point, there will be an opportunity to have some discussion, take part in discussion. And if you are happy to do so and you would like to, then feel free to obviously take part in that. But you will then appear in that recording if you are appearing on the video. Um, I won't give any really big introductions today, but just to say we are joined by some really fantastic people today to help us think through this topic. We're joined by Miranda Forsyth from Australian National University, Eva Aertsen from the University of Leuven, Lawrence Kershen KC, and Liz Fisher from the University of Oxford, who will all be chipping in with various insights and thoughts on this topic as we travel through today's event. So it's wonderful to see them all here. Um, at the very end of today's event, I will be sharing an evaluation form, and we would really value your thoughts, not only on this topic, but also just generally on events and what you might be interested in exploring. We are also hoping to have a sort of follow-up discussion in a few weeks' time, to kind of explore even more kind of what might come at the kind of the other end of this discussion today, and give people a further chance for discussion. We have the details of that finalised yet, but I'll send those details early next week. So keep an eye out for an email about that as well, because we would love to make this something that we can really be moving forward in the UK in a really practical way. So without further ado, can I hand over to Miranda, who's going to start today's event with a case study to really bring this to life for us of what this might mean.
Thanks so much, Joy. Thanks for the invitation to be here. So I've been looking at environmental restorative justice since about 2018 in the context of Australia, and really trying to envisage what it might be like, because we didn't have very many examples of practice. But just last year, there actually was an example. A restorative justice conference was held following a prosecution by the EPA in the state of New South Wales of the Forestry Corporation there. And it came about because the Forestry Corporation, who were the ones who log a lot of the forest, had accidentally logged six giant trees. So these giant trees are classified as having diameters of over a certain width when measured at standing at a particular height. And also three hollow bearing trees. And hollow bearing trees, as you can imagine, are very important for all of the creatures that live in the forest to build their homes in. So the Forestry Corporation accidentally did not tag these trees to not be logged, and they were cut down. And this happened in 2020. I just wanted to sort of to put this into context. If I can share my screen. Um, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see.
Yes. Okay then. So this is a photo that was taken. There was a film that was being made but this is the Wild Cattle Creek forest. You can see beautiful native forest. And this is an example of this is actually one of the trees that was cut down. It's hard to get a sense of scale, but one of the things that became apparent during the Restorative Justice Conference was that one of the trees that was cut down was in fact so big that the logging machinery that are designed to kind of to come and to process those trees simply wasn't able to do that, and so the tree was just left to lie there. That was a story that was recounted by one of the participants in the conference, who was a local Gambangia man, who are the traditional owners of that particular part of Australia. So the conference was held, it was convened by a very experienced facilitator. It took place over 2 days, and it had about 25 participants, and I was fortunate enough to be allowed to be there as an observer. And the conference had a lot of participants from the EPA and from the Forestry Corporation. Also, there were participants from the local traditional owner groups, the Gambangia. There was also one community representative who was the forest chaplain. And it went through the questions of, what had happened. And very quickly it became clear that although this had been a case about just, nine or just nine trees, in fact, there was a repeated series of events. So this was, you know, one of very many infractions by the Forestry Corporation. And there was a bit of a pattern where the Forestry Corporation would commit these offences. They would be prosecuted by the EPA. These are both government organisations, and the Forestry Corporation would pay a fine, again, back to the government. So there was like money was passing around different parts of the government, but nothing was changing. So the judge had suggested that a restorative justice conference be held. As a result of this conference, there were a series of recommendations that were put to the judge, and the judge decided at the end that the fine of 450,000 Australian dollars, which is about 250,000 pounds, I think, instead of being paid to the government, would be paid to one of the local Indigenous groups. And in order to carry out a number of restorative, uh, uh, a number of the, I suppose, of the recommendations that were listed in the that were coming out of the Restorative Justice Conference. So those were things such as a healing ceremony to take place, and also, very importantly, the giving a place to the Gumbaynggirr people in the working group that was designed to in order to make future decisions about logging in this particular part of the forest. So the decision was handed down a couple of months ago. We're yet to see how it is going to be implemented. I'll be watching that. I'll be carrying out some interviews with the participants to find, what their experiences were, and to start to see if we can understand, what lessons can be learned from this really important new step, I think, in Australia in terms of putting this environmental restorative justice idea into practice. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That really helps to bring this to life and make it not just an abstract concept, but something that's actually happening in the real world. I'm just also going to mention that Miranda might leave and not stay for the whole meeting because it is evening, late-ish evening in Australia. So she won't be around for the discussion portion later. But if there's any specific questions that you want me to put to her, feel free to email them to me or put them in the evaluation form, and we can ask and see if she can respond to those in some other way. I'd love to invite Eva now to give us a brief introduction of the guide. I'm just going to put the link in the chat for anyone who does want to have a look at it. It's a download link, it will download a PDF, but he will also just give us a brief overview. So I'm just going to share a slide that he asked me to share. There we are. Eva, do you want to take us away?
Okay, that seems to be fine. Thank you, and good afternoon to you all. In the coming minutes, indeed, I would like to present this practice guide that has been developed within the Working Group on Environmental Restorative Justice of the European Forum for Restorative Justice. It's a work that we have done during a couple of years, and that work was a next step for us in this working group on previous attempts and reflections and some publications that appeared on this challenging topic on how to apply restorative justice, or can we apply überhaupt, can we apply restorative justice to such complex phenomenon as environmental harm and environmental crime. So we very much believe that it was possible, and that there were good examples, as we learned from Miranda and other people, also in Australia and New Zealand mainly. And but we were also aware from the very beginning that it would not be self-evident, this kind of exercise on how to apply restorative justice from our common understandings of restorative justice principles and values, how to use this, how to apply this to such problem as environmental harm. And so we were aware that we would have to adapt many of our ideas, many of our concepts, principles on how to bring restorative justice into practice. So it was immediately clear for us that these were not the usual stakeholders, but that we had to learn to work with other stakeholders, environmental groups, for example, community groups, but also mainly also the other than human beings, which was very challenging for all of us to start thinking about how can we include the forest, the air, the fishes, how can we really work towards reparation of these entities. So we were a group of about 13 people who have contributed to writing up the practice guide. This was really a collaborative process for all of us. We took our time to do that. We were practitioners, scholars, community members, community organization representatives, environmental defenders, regulators, policymakers, and other individuals, 13 people in total coming from different parts of the world. The final editing work was coordinated very nicely by Felicity Tepper from Australia. So, okay, I would like now to referring to the slide that you see on your screen. I would like to refer now to the contents, making use of this table of contents that you see. So we started the practice guide with the glossary of terms such as environmental crime and harm. What is nature? What is the ecosystem? How do we understand that? What are other than human beings? But also what is reparation in this respect? What is accountability? What is sustainable development? How to understand this, how to use this when we try to apply restorative justice in such cases. There is then some information on the authors that were involved in making the practice guide. And there's a preface, very nicely written by John Braithwaite. Then we start with an introduction where we explain once again the importance, the relevance of doing this exercise, some of its challenges, and we also present the structured overview of what will come in this practice guide. Then there are, I think, 7 chapters, and the first chapter is about the nature of environmental harm. What are the main characteristics and types of environmental harm? This chapter introduces the concept of environmental harm, distinguishing it from environmental crime. Environmental harm, environmental crime. The chapter explores the main characteristics of environmental harm, giving attention to its complex, interdependent nature. And the chapter examines the roles and the nature of those responsible for harm, typically individuals, but also corporations and public entities. Very importantly, the chapter emphasizes the need to evolve our thinking from a traditionally anthropocentric approach to a more biocentric and ecocentric way of thinking and mindset. The second chapter is just about introducing restorative justice for those who might be less familiar with restorative justice. It presents restorative justice as a mechanism by which offenders, victims, and stakeholders are offered an alternative pathway to justice, to doing justice. And we have also in this chapter tried to identify some what we called entry points. If you wish to promote restorative justice for these cases, and if you wish to try it out together with institutional stakeholders, for example, in your jurisdiction or in your region, what are, legally speaking, policy making speaking, the possible links, entry points to sell the idea, to convince other people, to help you to realize it. In the third chapter, we become much more practical, and it is how to get started restorative processes in environmental cases, of course. It all starts with the selection and appointment of appropriate facilitators. It's a very important step. And then the chapter explores the initial steps and other important considerations, including gathering preliminary information about the case, identifying and securing the involvement of relevant stakeholders, and identifying and articulating other than human interests in the case. Chapter 4 then is about how to implement the whole process in practice. This chapter outlines a kind of ideal model for implementing environmental restorative justice processes through the perspective of conflict transformation. There's also kind of theoretical or conceptual framework presented in that chapter, but then it moves to describing the important phases in doing restorative justice in such cases. 4 phases are distinguished: preparing the stakeholders prior to bringing them together, conducting a facilitated dialogue, drawing up an agreement, and then implementing the agreement and following it up. So that is a very recognizable phases and structure, of course, for every restorative justice process. But a lot of attention is given in this chapter to a series of practical and operational details.
We have about 1 minute left, Ivo, so just to warn you.
Okay, I will hurry up. Thank you. Good idea. Yeah. The 5th chapter is about preventative possibilities for environmental restorative justice. It is not only about how to react to this kind of harm and crimes once they have occurred, but also can we use restorative values principles in a preventative way. So it is about collaborative decision making, for example, but also on how to adopt this kind of mindset, a kind of thinking and being, a way of thinking and being in a more profound relational way, and how can it influence our thinking and our behavior in general in society. I move very quickly to chapter 6, where cases are presented. We have identified 8 case studies. They are very diverse from different parts of the world. It is about landfill odors, for example, on discharge contamination, harming fish and cultural heritage, on wildlife crime in South Africa, and on chemical pollution, for example. Chapter 7 is then a summary and a list of practical recommendations. Then we finish this practice guide with additional resources, a lot of materials, not only publications, but also video, film materials, examples from other countries, and so on. And also very important, an outreach guide, which now will be presented more into detail, I think, by Lawrence. So that's it for me. I hope this has given at least a first idea about what the practice guide is. And of course, you are kindly invited to read it, to download it for free from the website of the European Forum, and to come with your feedback and further ideas on this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. That was a whistle-stop tour through the guide, and like I said, the link is in the chat if you want to download it and read it all in its fullness. I'll now pass over to Lawrence, who will talk to us about one of those annexes, the outreach guide.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joy, and thank you to you, the Mint House, for putting this event together and giving us an opportunity to promote this guide and let people know what it is. Thanks to the attendees. This sounds like an Oscar acceptance speech. It's not meant to be. But thanks to you guys, the attendees, for coming along, spending a bit of time with us. I also want to thank the co-authors and the contributors, because it's been an incredible labor of love in some ways to produce this guide, not least that it was Ivo's brainchild in the beginning, I think. So thank you, Ivo, but also Felicity Tepper, who's not here, who's done a phenomenal job of editing it. Okay, the bit that I would like to talk about is the so-called Annex or Appendix D. That's the outreach guide. And my belief is that the purpose of the outreach guide is really to develop and grow both the awareness of environmental restorative justice, how it works, its effectiveness, but also to encourage its take-up and its implementation. And the question that preoccupied me was, how can we spread both the knowledge of and the interest in the use of both restorative justice, which is an underlying theme in all this, but also of environmental restorative justice. And the outreach guide is really intended to raise awareness, to look at key areas where environmental restorative justice could work, could benefit people, and to provide approaches to address both actual and potential environmental conflicts. And I think that's one of the strengths of ERJ, that we can talk about potential conflicts, not just those that have already occurred. So my quick overview, hopefully quite short, of the outreach guide, and it is an imperfect guide in the sense that it's not complete. We can't cover everything, and we welcome any suggestions that any of you might have for enlarging its scope. But the highlights are really 5 areas that I want to cover. And the first is education, then business, then law, government agencies, and potential partners. So in education, obviously, I'm stating things that most of you will already be familiar with the idea of going into places of education in order to talk about the effectiveness of ERJ. It seems to me to be fundamental. So schools, universities, law schools, where there's already some interest in how this might apply. Talking to legal professionals, particularly the judiciary, and making them aware of what's available. Some of them, of course, already are, as we heard from Miranda's example and other examples to be found in the guide. Real life stories, it seems to me, are very persuasive. Stories of success, maybe even stories where it didn't work, but stories of the use of ERJ seems highly persuasive. At least it is to me when I hear a real life story, or I get an endorsement from someone who's been through the process, that is quite persuasive. And so stories, real life stories in the media, whether it's mainstream, digital, and so on, are all ways in which I believe we can grow awareness. Also, events, conferences, seminars, roundtables, and articles in both professional and specialist publications. So, in a way, I'm addressing this to those who already have ERJ in mind and how they might be able to promote it in the wider world. There's also business, and now we start to talk about some of the challenges. Eva's referred to some in the drafting of the document, in the drafting of the guide. But there are other challenges that we will have to address in business. For example, why would a business engage in what is still a voluntary process? Why would a business want to spend its time and money engaging if it's not forced to? And so the question of what's the ROI, the return on investment, seems to me to be a pretty important question for us, those of us who are seeking to engage with business, have to address. So making the business case, and there are things like, and the guide, the outreach guide refers to these things like, I'm going into three-letter acronyms now, CSR, ESG, SDGs. I'm sure you're all familiar with them, but if you're not, we'll talk about it later. But all the factors that encourage businesses to take an environmentally responsible approach. And the idea that a business can gain a market advantage by engaging in a process of this kind, not least because it builds social capital. It engages them, encourages them to engage with the community and to achieve cooperation from the community, who may be quite antagonistic towards them when this all starts. And of course, the question of legal risk. More and more with climate attribution science, there is a building, I believe, a building risk that companies have to take into account if they are to continue potentially dangerous practices, because there is now more and more opportunity for legal action to be taken against them. And the law, of course, is the third area that we have to pay attention to. The litigators, my colleagues in Doughty Street are fierce defenders of the environment, and the Climate and Environmental Justice group is very active. And I'm actively talking to them about the idea of and they're interested in the idea of using an RJ process in the sorts of environmental issues that they're having to deal with.
One minute left, Lawrence.
Thank you so much. I'll keep it short then. Fourthly, government agencies. Oh, well, it's worth saying, as far as litigation is concerned, that there is legislation in both the EU and the Council of Europe. There's also a looming law of ecocide, which I hope will come into effect, and when it does, that will bring extra questions for litigators. Fourthly, government agencies. The missing link often in these sorts of disputes is government, either local or national, and getting them engaged and addressing their perception of risk and their aversion to risk is one of the things we have to do as part of outreach. And lastly, partners or allies. Who might join with us? Who might we, if we want to promote an environmental restorative justice process, join with in order to join with existing schemes? So there are mediation schemes both in at the community level and, for example, at OECD level. There are legal aid clinics, there are NGOs, and the NGOs are hugely active in promoting rights of nature, the interests of nature, and circumstances where there might be an ERJ intervention. And there are environmental defenders in Australia, New Zealand, and so on. So, and lastly, champions. I've been thinking about who might be a champion for ERJ, and if anyone knows David Attenborough and has his ear, please let us know, because it seems to me that if he got this, he would be a real champion for ERJ. So that's an imperfect overview. We welcome other suggestions, but the bottom line for me is that RJ works. It is a methodology that is tried and tested. ERJ works. You've only got to look at chapter 6, I think it is, of the guide, and you'll see some good examples there, as Ivo has already referred to. So it's a methodology that works, and the gap is that people don't know that it's available. And I believe you guys who are here will be part of the what shall I say, the spreading of information about ERJ, because the outreach guide suggests ways to change perceptions. The whole guide, in fact, offers other possibilities to address environmental harm in a new and more effective way. So
much.
I can leave it there.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's really helpful to think practically about what some of those next steps might be and who should reach out to.
Mm.
We're going to come now to Professor Liz Fisher from Oxford University. She is an expert in environmental law. Liz, we'd love to hear your reflections on this. What do you think when you come across these ideas? What maybe do you think are the opportunities? What are the challenges? Do you think it could work, especially in the context that already exists in the world? What are your thoughts? We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Mint House for putting this on, and thank you most importantly to the authors of this fantastic guide. In my comments, I really want to sort of identify 3 features of the guide which I think are particularly significant, and I want to make one provocation because I'm an academic. In making these comments, I should stress I'm talking in my academic capacity, so my nerd capacity. And secondly, I'm not an expert in restorative justice. Okay, so 3 features of the guide which I think are particularly striking from my perspective. The first is, I suspect some people will say, why is there a chapter about environmental harm and defining? Is that just academics, having a kind of academic debate? No, this is what really, really matters. Environmental problems are issues to do with environmental quality, and they are inherently complex for a couple of reasons. First, and Miranda's example illustrated this perfectly, they are often the product of a kind of thoughtlessness, an institutional thoughtlessness, an individual kind of thoughtlessness. Secondly, and this comes out very well in the guide, they are also often about a kind of form of what Rob Nixon has described, slow violence. They happen over time. There's not a single event. Communities over the time experience degraded environmental quality. Thirdly, the actions are often what Amitav Ghosh has described as uncanny, i.e., people think what they're doing is the right thing, and they don't realize that their behavior, or at least they are thoughtless about their behavior and its implications on others. So that means that environmental problems are very real, but they are distinctive types of problems from other kind of problems. Now, I say distinctive, I don't mean unique. Now, all of this, I think, comes out beautifully in the guide, both in the discussion of environmental harm and also in the discussion of processes and the case studies. The second point about environmental problems, which I think is really important to take into account in relation to the guides, is that a lot of the time we often think environmental law is about strategy. How do you get to the result? In reality, environmental law is about dealing with trouble cases, about conflicts and disagreements in communities about the kind of shared physical and socio-political conditions of those communities. And that's why things like environmental restorative justice are particularly important. The idea of trouble cases I take from the work of the legal realist Carl Leuven. So what a lot of environmental law is about is finding resolution to those kind of conflicts. Some may be very small scale. They may be happening in individual communities. Some can be very large scale and global. And the importance of resolving trouble cases is one of the reasons, for example, that you have environmental courts in places like New South Wales, etc. Now, these disputes, again, lawyers think about disputes. They're distinctive, again, because they are disputes not just over the terms of a contract, where the fixed interests are. They are disputes within communities, which are both about those communities and the physical world those communities are in. And again, I think you can see lots of examples in the guide taking all of this into account. The third feature of the guide, which I think is particularly striking, and this is my prop that I'm always using for my students, there are no magic wands when it comes to resolving environmental disputes. What there is the need for active and conscientious action that is mindful of the complexity of the issues. And that can be seen in the guide, the emphasis on preparation, the thoughtfulness that it encourages in the taking of each step. And I think with the case studies showing that environmental restorative justice is not a one-size-fits-all model. It is, a way of thinking towards an ongoing, and again, I think this is particularly important, the ongoing resolution and management of ongoing issues. Now, this can seem very non-glamorous. When I was editing this book during the pandemic, which is on the Land and Environment Court of New South Wales, there's a fantastic chapter in here by Mary Walker on dispute resolution. And my husband, who is also a legal academic, used to laugh that our discussions were about where the filing cabinet is and other such exciting issues in dispute resolution, to which my reply was, yeah, but it really does matter where the filing cabinet is. And again, I think that attention and thoughtfulness to detail can be seen in the report. So here's my provocation. The title of this event is A New Approach. There was one three-letter acronym that Lawrence didn't mention, and that is ADR, Alternative Dispute Resolution. So to me, that environmental restorative justice is not a new process. As the report quite rightly points out, we can see it within Indigenous communities. But one can also see it as part of a wider process of alternative dispute resolution. So if we take something like the work of the Land and Environment Court, last time I looked at the statistics, about 2/3 of their work is done through a range of ADR processes. And to me, and this comes to Lawrence's questions of thinking about businesses are engaged in ADR all the time. So to me, my provocation is to say this is not new. What really matters, and this comes back to the foreword by John Braithwaite, where he says this volume inspires the imagination. Imagination are the mental constructs we use as professionals. And as lawyers, ADR hasn't always been seen as in the skill set. What I think this report does is shows that it should be, and that it should be in a way that takes into account the complexity of environmental problems, the need to restore troubled cases, thinking about restorative justice, and finally, it really does matter where the filing cabinet is. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a really wonderful comment, and I think we appreciate the provocation. That's why we asked you to give your comments. We're now going to move into a time of sort of question, answer, discussion, and we'd really encourage you to take part in this discussion, those of you who are attending, if you have questions or comments. To think now about that question of where and how can we develop this in the UK. I think a lot of us love the idea of this work and we can see how it's happened in other places in the world, but we would really love to see this actually happening in the UK and actually cases being taken on and moved forward. So does anyone have any sort of initial comments or questions either to make from your own perspective or questions for those who have already spoken today about what you think might be some of the next steps that we could take? I think Myra's holding a hand up.
A quick question, please. I find it interesting that there were 8 case studies in a European publication, but no European case study. So is the problem not just UK? Is it more a region-wide issue? Why has ERJ in idea form and in practice thrived in other parts of the world, but not here?
Does anyone feel able to jump in with that? Yeah, there's.
So, sorry, I have a wonderful doctoral student who works on thinking about environmental law in Australia and Chile. And in one of the points that she makes is that these are countries which are natural resources administrative states. And so the environmental issues and issues about conflict have, in a sense, been part of the development of law and state far earlier than in other countries. Now, I'm not offering that as a reason, but I think it's a really interesting argument.
No, it's a good reflection. Ivo, did you want to say something?
I completely agree, Myra. This was also one of our frustrations, not to find good examples, or almost no good examples in Europe, on the European continent, or in Britain. Indeed, we were very much aware of that. Why it developed then faster and better in New Zealand or in Australia, for example, or in Canada. Well, I also do not know, but I can also imagine that one of the factors might be the important role of indigenous communities and problematic of the indigenous communities in those countries, which plays a more important role than in Europe, maybe. So, yeah, but maybe Miranda or Mark Hamilton, who is here as well, they can answer this question better.
Lawrence, I think you'd raised your hand, and then maybe we can go to Miranda for any comments.
I just want to add, I could have added to the case studies at least two environmental type, well, they're stakeholder dialogues, so in the environmental field. So I don't know if they quite qualify, but they certainly have happened in my experience, in my own personal experience. So I guess what I'm saying is there are some examples that I absolutely agree with Eva that the absence of the drive of indigenous people and the rights of indigenous people is different in this, certainly in the UK and arguably in Europe. But there are examples, it is being used. It might not have the formal name of ERJ, but it's being done certainly in the UK to my knowledge, but perhaps not as much as elsewhere.
Yeah. Miranda, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I think it hasn't really taken off in Australia as yet. As I said, that case was one of the first really. New Zealand is probably the place where you can say that there's been a flourishing, but it did, and now it seems to have tapered off a bit. But yeah, I would also invite Mark Hamilton, who's here, to talk about that because he's certainly the expert on restorative justice, environmental restorative justice in New Zealand.
Mark, are you here
I
and
am.
willing to say something? And then I'll go to Louise for a comment.
I was trying to hide in the background, but thank you
Sorry
for
about that.
inviting me to speak. I think in New Zealand it started with young offenders, and then in 2000, I think it was, there was a couple of pieces of important legislation which were not environmentally specific, but more restorative justice specific. And from there, that legislation's been used. And I think we've got up to about 67 examples of restorative justice in New Zealand. And that was driven partly by the legislation, but also by a prominent judge who was very pro restorative justice, Justice McElrea. Justice Preston from the Land Environment Court got word of Justice McElrea's publications and then was reading them, and that's what prompted him to ask the parties in the first two New South Wales cases. So it goes to show that judicial leadership is important. To answer one of Lawrence's questions, judicial leadership is important, especially as the example from New Zealand and also New South Wales shows.
Yeah, thank you. Louise, you had your hand up. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, it was to ask a question, if that's okay.
Of course.
I work for like a political, like environmental campaigning group, so in the UK, and so for me, it's about like the practicalities of this is my question, I guess. And is there like a legal structure for this that exists in the UK? Is it something that is possible to actually employ in trial, or is it are you more at the theoretical stage where you're trying to build a case for it? Yeah, is it something that can be used, I guess, already?
Lawrence, do you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, it's a good question, Louise. In 2013, the Courts Act, you may know this, the Courts Act, okay, um, uh, basically legislation says that in any adult criminal proceeding, the court can adjourn if the parties want mutually a restorative justice process. So that, in a sense, in a criminal context, empowers an RJ process. As for the and therefore you could say Parliament has endorsed the use of RJ. As for the rest, I think it's on the basis that we operate in the UK that if it isn't explicitly forbidden, we can do it. So if you, outside the context of a criminal case, if you had a potential harm or one that you couldn't litigate, that there is nothing to stop you organizing a or calling for an environmental restorative justice process because it's not prohibited. I think that's probably a very British way of approaching it. But anyway, so there's nothing to stop you. Indeed, if the parties agree, it would be encouraged, I believe, encouraged by the courts, should it ever reach there.
Any other thoughts on that from anyone who feels confident to chip in?
That was the experience in New South Wales. The first two decisions involving Justice Preston as the Chief Judge, there was no legislative permissions, as to speak, which allowed those conferences, but just the inherent power of the court to case manage a matter meant that the Restorative Justice Conference could happen in both of those cases and be considered in sentencing. Now, of course, in in Victoria, in Australia, we've got facilitative legislation, which hasn't been used, which is funny because it's come out in 2016. So I think legislation on its own is not enough to drive restorative justice. But there seems to be a need of a combination of things to drive it.
One thing I thought was particularly interesting about the example that we had Miranda share, which is why I'm so pleased that she was able to share that, is that sort of the resolution of that was sort of within the existing framework of fines, but then they were able to sort of direct some of that into what would normally have been a fine paid, as Miranda said, to the government to then redirect that money to be used in more restorative and sort of community-based outcomes. So I'm not an expert in either this area, but that's something to me that seemed very interesting that that might potentially be one way in with some disputes is to follow kind of existing frameworks for penalties for organizations that cause harm, and then seeing what can maybe be done to, if there are situations where fines would normally be given, to see what can be done with those funds and to use those for restorative work in whatever form that might seem most appropriate. Yeah, Miranda.
And I can just give you another example of a way that it can come up. So we have these things called enforceable undertakings in Australia, where a company generally agrees to undertake a number of measures in return for not being prosecuted. And I think they appear, you have similar things in other parts of the world, a deferred prosecution, I think it's called in the US. And often those things are just negotiated between the company and the regulator or the prosecutor. But we had an example in 2012 in Victoria where the community that was affected by this was a land, sorry, a place for storing waste, and it was very smelly, and the community was very badly affected by those odors. And so there was a conference that was held, and as a result of that conference, there were particular things that were included in that enforceable undertaking that wouldn't have been included otherwise. So something like, they were worried about the impact on their health as a result of these smells. And, the company and the EPA were saying, it's all fine, don't worry about it. Well, they said, well, no, we want to have an independent investigation. And so that was included. So I suppose one of the things that we've tried to look at as well, in the research we did with the Victorian EPA, was to find what we called spaces for restorative approaches, and that might not be necessarily at the end when you've got a prosecution, but at the start as well. So thinking about, if you're doing investigations, how can investigations be done in ways that are more restorative, that ways that bring in the community, that bring in traditional owner groups and so forth. Sorry, I said I wasn't going to say the whole thing, and then I end up dominating.
No, it's great. We're thrilled to have you here and hear your insights. Are there any other comments, either to follow on from that or on a different topic? Any other questions? Is anyone aware of any possible areas where there might be an opening for this in the UK? Any disputes that you're aware of? Oh, sorry, Myra.
If I can come in on that, I take heart from the comments. Firstly, what Miranda said about spaces and illustrating how it's about entering into existing processes rather than being something separate and independent of legal procedures. It's looking for being allies to and critical partners with the current legal system. And I heard the same from Liz when she talked about there are restorative elements in alternative dispute resolution. So I think there are many cases in the UK and elsewhere where community groups, environmental groups, are working extremely hard within the system to increase the space for voices to be heard and are pushing the edges of the system so that it looks to different ways of working. So I come back to my first question of why no cases? And it seems to me we need not to start with the perfect examples, but we need to look at where it's seeping in to the system. And I think in many human rights cases, restorative values are very present.
Any other thoughts or comments or questions?
Hi.
Shreya?
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I'm in a public space, so it's a bit loud, but I was just wondering how the political climate can affect decisions or the use of RJ within these systems, because I know Matthew mentioned earlier how there are 67 cases, but since National and the ACT Coalition have happened in New Zealand, I'm assuming that there is a significant environmental decline and less of a presence as to like the care for less of a care for nature, because the entire climate or the governmental system is kind of like removing these rights. And over here we have a huge rise of the climate in the UK. And we're wondering how we can prevent these harms from occurring even further. Just wondering if anyone has any thoughts on that as well.
Anyone feel able to respond to that?
I can talk about the New South Wales Land and Environment Court because that's something I do know about. And I think it's not so much, and I'm only talking about that context, and I think it's really important to see that each context and each legal culture will be different. But what I would point out about the Land and Environment Court is that it is a legal culture which is committed, it was the first environmental court in the world. The legal expertise of the people in that court, both in mainstream law and thinking about ADR, is very significant. So to me, one of the biggest challenges is actually about capacity and competence. And again, pointing to the report, there is so much expertise that has gone into that report. But any use of restorative justice does need people with skills. It also, I think, needs to be recognised that, and again, looking at the case studies, that restorative justice is about very individualised, circumstances and very specific circumstances in specific places. Now, my view would be that that's a lot of environmental law, but in thinking about that capacity, it doesn't again need to be recognised. There are not magic wands. I won't wave it again.
Thank you. Marion, you want to say something, and then I think we might have to start closing up this gathering.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that throughout the years I kind of heard of quite a lot of cases in the UK where some kind of dialogue process has taken place, because quite often the environmental harms are there. It's not simply like in very many criminal justice cases, it's sort of A versus B. There's usually at least three, if not more, stakeholders. So the kind of very common scenario is in some nice place in the country, there are conservationists wanting to preserve the land and the biodiversity, and then there are people who want jobs, and then other people who want the kind of to kind of do logging, or sort of use the kind of things that are there, so mining or logging or whatever. And so you're actually trying to reconcile sort of whole very different kinds of sort of needs. So that always seems to be a kind of distinguishing factor, really. And especially when you kind of bring in the kind of conservation angle, that the land needs to have its say as well, and that seems to me something that does need sort of different approaches, because it's not simple. It's not just a question of saying, oh, sorry, we chopped down the wrong tree. It's actually reconciling very different interests.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you, Marion. Right, we're coming to a close here. I want to say a big thank you again to all of our speakers today. I think that's been a really interesting and stimulating discussion. Like I alluded to at the beginning, we'd love this to be an ongoing discussion and something that we'd like to explore further. We don't have a date yet, but we're hoping to have a follow-up, more informal discussion in a couple of weeks' time. So I'll send an email next week with some sort of links and follow-up information, and hopefully I'll have some details for you then. If you'd like to take part in a follow-up conversation to think about if there is anything we can be doing practically to be doing moving this forward in the UK. I'll put links to the practice guide and the European Forum for Restorative Justice, Environmental Restorative Justice Working Group in the chat now, in case you're interested in looking at either of those. I'd also, as I said before, be really grateful if you could fill out the evaluation form, and partly just so we can make better events in the future, but also there is a question on there about what you think might be useful for moving this forward in the UK, whether that's training or whether having like ongoing network, or anything else that you might think might be useful for the UK context to kind of really pursue environmental restorative justice here in the UK. So if you could fill out that evaluation form, that'd be great. If you want to click the link now, it will open up in your browser window, and that way when I close the call, you won't lose that link. Other things just to mention, we do have some other Mint House events coming up, nothing specifically on environmental restorative justice, but lots of other things happening both online and in person, so you can go to our website to see other events. And also, I know there are a few familiar faces here, people who I know are regulars to events from the Mint House that I'm familiar with, but I know we do have several new people here today. So if you'd like to stay on our email mailing list, there's also a link there to join our email newsletter list, because I can't save your email addresses from today's event without your permission. So if you'd like to keep updated with what's going on, both environmental restorative justice and other work that we're doing, we'd love you to join that list. I think that's everything for today. Thank you so much for everyone for taking part. And it's, yeah, really interesting to think about what we can be doing longer term with this work. So thanks again to everyone for joining us and hopefully see you all soon. Thank you very much.